Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's having a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragonsjewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan, and I'm just going to get all that wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way first. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so. It's just down below there. And of course, any love, comments, suggestions, all those wonderful things, there's that comment section down there. And don't forget to hit that like button as well. Today we are going to be doing our Ghostly Echoes series, and we had been going through the province of Alberta. I have now finished up Alberta, and we are moving west to British Columbia, also known as BC. So those will be the next series of ghost stories that we'll be covering starting this episode. We'll see how far we get with those, and I hope you guys enjoy these next few spooky tales. This story takes place at Arrow Lake, British Columbia, an enigmatic escort. In the late 1920s, Frederick William Lindsay was a young man, something of a dandy. Fred had been living the high life. He was drifting around British Columbia, thoroughly enjoying the cockiness of his youth, when the Great Depression came crashing down on him, and on most of the rest of the world. The young man's life changed for the worst, virtually overnight. Even so, he was considerably better off than many. At least he wasn't begging or riding the rails. A make-work project, jointly sponsored by both the provincial and federal governments, was created to construct the High Arrow Dam at Arrow Lake to increase its size. Fred and dozens of other men sought refuge from the Depression there. Although they were paid only $7 per month to work more hours per week than would probably be legal today, anyone who could get on at a work camp was considered fortunate, for they were neither starving nor homeless, as were many people in British Columbia through the dirty 30s. Fred's easy spending ways didn't leave him as quickly as his money did, so on a certain evening in November 1932, he found himself alone in the camp bunkhouse, too broke to attend the local dance with his mates. Boredom soon set in. His mind wandered back over some of the more exciting evenings that he enjoyed in his life in more prosperous times. Goodness knows what made me think of the glass of water and the crystal ball, Fred commented some 30 years after the fact. But think of it I did. Apparently somewhere in his travels, someone had told Fred Lindsay that a simple glass of water could be used in place of a crystal ball. Given that such an experiment was one of the few diversions available to him at the moment, he decided to give it a try. He filled an ordinary kitchen tumbler full of water and set it on the table in front of him. The coal lamp gave off something of an eerie glow as Fred gazed into the glass of water. Mere seconds later, he began to feel foolish. What if any of his bunkmates were to come home early and find him doing anything so silly? He'd never live it down. Their teasing would make his life miserable for months, Fred knew. But then, just as he was about to abandon his trial, he noticed that the water in the glass was becoming cloudy. As he stared in disbelief, the plain tap water took on a milky quality. Fascinated by the bizarre changes that he was witnessing, Fred stared intently at the center of the cloudy liquid. He thought that he saw a small dark area. Slowly the nondescript dark patch resolved itself into the form of a tiny likeness of a person, a man. It was a man whom Fred Lindsay recognized. There before him was the image of his recently deceased friend, Jack McFarlane. Fred peered more closely at the amazing sight. As the miniature figure in the cloud continued to become clearer and clearer, Fred became even more concerned. Black Jack, as Fred had always called his friend, was dressed in a hooded robe. He was gesturing angrily towards Fred. The manifestation was furiously mouthing words. He shook his fist at me while apparently giving me a terrible calling down, but I could not hear him. I could only see him, Fred recalled. Slowly, just as they had appeared, first the image and then the cloudiness of the liquid disappeared from the glass. The glass of the water was once again just a plain glass of water, but Fred was, understandably, a shaken man. Not knowing what he'd done or what he should do about it, a man climbed into his bed and fell into a fitful sleep, not even awakening when his friends noisily made their way back from the dance. The next morning, he did his best to put the entire experience out of his mind. As New Year's Eve 1932 led to New Year's Day 1933, there wasn't much for Fred or anyone else to celebrate in Arrow Lake work camp. Life continued on, and one boring day, very much resembling the boring day that had gone before it. The last week of January, however, brought at least a bit of excitement to the restless young man. A trapper who was passing through stayed in the bunkhouse for a few nights and entertained the isolated workers with tales of his trials and travels. He recounted many adventures, including one involving a miner who he'd met on the north side of the Monashee Mountains and who'd been looking for a partner. Fred Lindsay had just bored enough with the stultifying security of his situation to latch onto such a fragment of information. He immediately began making plans to leave the work camp and find the miner. The friends he'd made at the dam building project tried their best to dissuade him. "It's second-hand information, Fred. Don't risk what you have here for that," said one. "It's winter. You're never going to make it out of the valley alive," said another. Their words were not news to Fred. He had said them all to himself, with no effect. Scourging what little food and supplies he could, on February 2nd, 1933, the restless young man set out to begin his foolhardy mission. His route was deeply covered in snow. He managed to salvage a pair of snowshoes, but as they were in poor repair and he had no experience walking with them, these supposed aids were initially a serious disadvantage. For the first several kilometers he fell with almost every step, until he finally mastered the distinctive gait necessary to take advantage of the ungainly apparatus. Hours later, he made so little progress and was so discouraged that he thought briefly of heading back to the security of the work camp, boring or not. The knowledge of the unrelenting teasing that he knew he'd take was the only thing that made Fred press on. Even the thought of finding the seemingly mythical miner had little importance to him now. At 10 that night, a bone-weary Fred turned off the trail in search of a trapper's cabin that he'd heard was nearby. He did find it, but many weeks too late to do him any good. The makeshift shelter had collapsed under the weight of the snow on its roof. He chose a spruce tree as shelter instead and pulled some of the food that he'd brought out of his pack. Refreshed by the nourishment, Fred headed out again, this time in a more positive frame of mind. He would make it, he told himself, as long as he kept going. Although it had been dark for some time, the snow reflected the light of the moon, and the stars had provided enough illumination to allow him to see his way. As midnight approached, though, the night suddenly became darker. Fred looked up and realized that clouds were scuttling across the sky. Moments later, and oddly, since it was early February, it began to rain. The optimistic mood of little more than an hour before gave way to near panic. It was too dark now for Fred to see his way, and soon he was soaking wet. Worse, he was walking on several meters of snow that was rapidly turning to slush with the rain pelting down on it. He couldn't think of stopping. He knew that if he did stop, he'd eventually freeze to death, particularly if the temperature dropped. But keeping going was nearly impossible. He inched his way along, fighting to remain conscious, as the cold penetrated his bones and hypothermia began to set in. Just when Fred was sure that his situation could not get worse, it did. A strong northerly wind whipped up. Anything with any moisture in it, including Fred's clothing, quickly became coated in a layer of ice. He willed himself to keep going by focusing on the concept that to stop now would mean certain death. Just a few steps more, and the weakened man was driven to his knees by the gusts of freezing rain and the weight of the ice that encrusted him. The once confident and foolhardy young man pushed on as long as he was able. He was within sight of the Monashee range when his will to carry on finally gave out. Telling himself that he'd only rest for a moment or two, he dragged himself to the base of a huge sheltering tree. Even though he knew that staying there for just a few minutes would unquestionably mean death, he was unable to resist the temptation. Embracing the opportunity to lose consciousness, Fred was drifting away when an unseen force jolted him awake. He jumped to his feet and scanned what he was able to see on the horizon around him. The storm's strength was continuing to build. Totally disoriented, the frozen and half-dead man had no idea in which direction safety lay. He stood for only a second before deciding that laying down to die right where he was would be his most sensible choice. Then, just in front of him, Fred thought that he saw something vaguely human-shaped approaching through the blowing maelstrom. It couldn't be. He must be hallucinating, he told himself. Still, though, it really did look like the outline of a man. A man in a hooded robe stood not 50 feet from Fred, and was signaling for Fred to follow him. Unsure at first as to what he was seeing and how best to respond, Fred merely stood and stared. He suddenly realized that the gesturing manifestation in front of him looked familiar. It was the vision that had appeared in the water glass at the bunkhouse that November night. That apparition had been a precursor to the appearance in the storm. Now Fred understood why the ghost of his friend had seemed so angry that night as he now realized, the future. Jack's spirit had to leave its eternal rest in order to guide Fred out of the danger that he'd foolishly placed himself in. Barely conscious, Fred followed the phantom, even though the image was heading in exactly the opposite direction from that which Fred's badly muddled mind told him safety lay in. Faster and faster the two went, the phantom always staying just beyond Fred's reach. With each step, Fred became warmer and more lucid. He determined that the smoothness with which his former friend moved across the ice-coated snowy terrain meant that the other man must have the advantage of gliding along on skis. At the bottom of a slope and protected from the wind, Fred began to feel that he was back in the land of the living. He looked around and spotted a cabin just ahead. As he headed to the shelter, Fred turned to call out a thank you to his phantom friend. But Black Jack McFarland was nowhere to be seen. The door to the refuge was unlocked and Fred Lindsay let himself in. Seconds later, he was collapsed beneath a pile of blankets on a bed in the corner of the rough-hewn little log dwelling. He slept the clock around without waking. When he finally did come awake, Fred helped himself to the provisions that he found on the cabin shelf. As soon as he was able, he looked outside. The turbulent weather had died down, and no more snow or rain had fallen while he'd been sleeping. Hesitantly, Fred made his way out the door. His own snowshoe prints were clearly visible where he had come down the hill and into the cabin, but nowhere was there any sign that his friend Black Jack had also made the trek. There were no footprints, snowshoe tracks, or grooves from skis. It was as if the image that Fred had seen so clearly had either not been there or had been gliding just above the snow. His body rested and fed, and his curiosity provoked. Fred retraced his tracks up the hillside until he came to a tree that he'd collapsed under. It had been easy to find again, for his snowshoe markings had led him directly there. He was shocked to realize that the ghost had not only led him to safety, but also away from certain death. If Fred had followed his own inclinations, he would have fallen over a sheer cliff into a crevice and hit the granite boulders more than 100 meters, 300 feet below. It took 2 visits from the ghost of his friend Jack McFarlane to shake Fred Lindsay's skepticism. But from that day onward, the man believed in spirits. From this new perspective, he looked back at the events of his past, including a life-threatening incident in his younger days. At the time, he was working as a brakeman on a logging train on Vancouver Island. He had been riding on a car full of logs as the engineer rounded a bend too quickly. The rolling stock buckled at Fred's car, derailing that car and causing it to rip up track in its path. Something or someone had plucked the youth from his perch and placed him on a ledge 5 meters, 16 feet, over from where he'd been, and 4 meters, 13 feet higher. As he clung to his precarious hold, Fred watched the action unfold below him. After the train stopped, he noted that none of his fellow crew members had apparently been injured either, for they were all running about shouting his name. When he was composed enough to respond, Fred called out to them to assure them that he was alive. He then cautiously made his way down the embankment to the accident site below. There, one of his co-workers told him how he'd seen Fred appear to fly up and away from danger, as if propelled by some invisible hand. At the time, Fred hadn't known who or what had been responsible for an inexplicable escape from death. It wasn't until his second brush with the Grim Reaper that the man finally accepted the reality of forces from beyond our realm. By the way, this ghost story ends on a further positive note. Fred Lindsay did find the miner whom he risked his life to search for, and he did become the man's partner. And as long as he lived, he never forgot his supernatural lifesaver. This story takes place south of Kelowna, British Columbia. The Ghost Riders. It was an August day in 1984, and Harold McDougall and his son Gary, a photographer from Penticton, were enjoyably exploring the remote terrain around Eleanor Lake near Naramata in the province's Okanagan Valley, just south of Kelowna. While stopped for a trailside lunch, the pair felt totally isolated from the world as they had savored their food and appreciated the peaceful quiet of their surroundings. To their great surprise, the 2 men heard the distinctive sounds of horse hoofs approaching along the trail. Moments later, a group of 5 riders appeared in a nearby clearing. The 2 oldest, the McDougalls surmised, might have been the parents of the 3 younger ones. All the riders were dressed in clothing that was far too heavy for a warm summer's day. The men wore cloth hats, suspenders to hold up their heavyweight trousers, and high riding boots. Their horses' saddles were simple, adorned only by the heavy canvas bags strapped to them. The vision that the McDougalls cast their eyes upon that day was undeniably a strange one. The approaching family's odd appearance was certainly no reason for rudeness, so Harold called out a greeting. This simple gesture appeared to startle the travelers. When the man, that the 2 hikers presumed to be the father of the younger 3 riders, regained his composure, he touched his hat briefly in acknowledgement before quickly leading his little group away from the 2 men. As the group of riders slowly came past the father and son who'd been enjoying their trailside lunch, the pair noted something most unusual: silence. The family riding past at a trot seemed enveloped in a casing of total silence. A silence so complete that it absorbed the surrounding sounds of leaves rustling and birds chirping, and even the gurgling of a nearby brook. More than a little intrigued, Harold and Gary waited just a moment before attempting to follow the family, if only to get a second look that might somehow confirm what they'd just seen. They hurried to the trail, which was as straight as an arrow at that point, although they could see clearly for a considerable distance in either direction. They could spot no trace of either the 5 people or their horses. Stranger still, as the McDougals walked along the dirt trail, they noted that their own steps left footprints on the ground, but there was no signs of any print from horse hooves. Then they realized what, other than being excessive for the weather, was odd about the family's clothing. It was of a style from a much earlier era. For just a moment, apparently Gary and Harold McDougall were privy to a peek backward through the curtain of time. On a farm not far from Eleanor Lake, but many years before the incident described above, 2 brothers left their house on a snowy winter evening to tend to their chores. When Sam and Edward Richards were finished tending to the horses in the barn, they came outside and noticed a man walking toward them. The lad saw the image clearly and later described it as being dressed all in white. Their farmstead home was in the rolling foothills and extremely isolated, so this sight struck both boys as being very odd. Thinking that the man had lost his way, they called out to him, but they got no response. The image merely continued along the path upward to the Richards' house. The boys followed it, or tried to, for seconds later, the man that they'd both distinctively seen vanished. Sam and Edward rushed in to tell their parents of the strange trespasser. Upon hearing their son's news, Mr. and Mrs. Richards were just as concerned as their youngsters had been. They immediately bundled up and followed the boys out to the yard. There was no one there, nor were there any footprints in the snow. At their parents' urging, the Richards boys described the white coat that the image had been wearing. It was fully clear to them what had happened. Like the McDougals in the previous story, the boys had had a first-hand look at the past. They had experienced retrocognition. This story takes place in Courtenay, British Columbia. The Siwash Sightings. The dark and stormy night has a long and well-deserved reputation as a traditional setting for a scary story. Although nocturnal turbulence is undeniably a provocative context, surely the inherent eeriness of pre-dawn stillness is equally suggestive for a ghostly sighting. Indeed, it was the latter situation that provided the setting for a series of frightening sightings in the Siwash Cemetery, near the city of Courtenay, on the east side of Vancouver Island. 3 sailors who saw the cemetery apparition while on shore leave were petrified, frozen on the spot in fear. They huddled together at the side of the road in terror until sunup, and then steadfastly refused to discuss, even among themselves, the vision that they had been witness to, until much later. A number of community members who also saw the manifestations were likewise initially unwilling to share information about their experience with anyone but their closest confidants. Once people began to talk about what they had seen, word spread quickly. During the Christmas season of 1940 and continuing until just after New Year's Day 1941, the story of this island ghost made headlines all over Canada. The first person amenable to being identified in connection with this ghost story was a skeptic named Bill Spurl. He was at least acknowledged that he was indeed seeing something most extraordinary. Spurl had been thoroughly intrigued by the floating image that he had seen in the cemetery and had stopped to watch it for some time. He readily admitted that the manifestation resembled a human being, but he added that the way the mysterious shape moved and undulated indicated that it could not possibly have been a person. Later in the day, Spurl confirmed for excited journalists that he'd watched the strange form straddling the road ahead of him, and he stared. The white swaying shape took on a green glow and then dissolved. The other witness willing to be interviewed after sighting the phantom was a Kalmox resident named William Day. Like Spurl, Day was a skeptic. He was quoted as saying, "I have always laughed at ghosts and things of that kind." Despite this bias, Day described the apparition in detail, noting that he had the advantage of carrying a lamp at the time that the image had appeared. Initially, the spectre appeared as a white form about 7 meters, 20 feet, ahead of Day. The vision moved toward him in a sort of dance step before disappearing, literally in the blink of an eye. The startled man stood still for a moment, trying to make some sense out of what he'd just seen, before continuing on his way. As he stared, an image of a woman came out of nowhere, he told a journalist. Thinking that someone was making sport of him, William Day approached the manifestation, which vanished as he stared at it. Perhaps because they were both skeptics, neither of these two men were terrified by their experiences the way the sailors were. Day did not offer an explanation for the strange vision that he had observed. Spurl decided that since the sightings were occurring just before dawn, what had really been seen was simply a mist with color changes, caused by phosphorescent picked up from the nearby sea spray. No doubt such vapors have, on occasion, been misinterpreted as a paranormal phenomena. In this case, however, Bill's rational explanation seemed to strain credibility further than merely accepting the existence of ghosts. Surely, if the sightings had been misidentified sea mists, they would have continued on even until today, but the spectre vanished for the last time after the first week in 1941, and it has never been seen again. This story takes place on Old Caribou Trail, British Columbia. A bizarre old story. One of the oldest ghost stories in Canada took place on the Old Caribou Trail, or Caribou Wagon Road, between Yale and Lewitt. The road was completed in 1864, but the route saw little traffic for the first few years. Many of those who did travel that way were never heard from again. It seems that the route was haunted by a vengeful phantom. Little is left in the way of documentation for this old and bizarre ghost story, but what information has been passed down is enough to let anyone know that supernatural forces were at work. The story begins with a man named John Fillmore, who was leading a team of men and mules along the trail. They were taking supplies to miners and had made their way as far as Spence's Bridge by the time night fell on August 5th, 1863. The group, consisting of 12 men and 50 pack animals, made camp for the night. They ate a hearty dinner, appointed guards to stand watch, and then turned in for the night. The next morning, Fillmore asked the guards if anything untoward had happened through the night. He was told that shortly after the men and mules fell asleep, a strange white light had appeared in the sky, but other than that, there had been no unusual events. Fillmore barely had time to contemplate what the light that the man had seen could possibly have been before another of his party approached him in obvious distress. It seemed that some of the mules were missing. In a separate incident, 3 nights later, and closer to Yale, George Latu and his party were making their way with a group of pack mules. The beasts were loaded down with nuggets of gold that Latu and the others had just mined. That night, the newly wealthy men noted strange white lights in the sky moving in a semicircle. By the next morning, some of their mules had vanished. Not connecting these ghost lights with the animals' disappearance, the men began to question one another before heading out to try to find the missing mules. The beasts had to be somewhere, they reasoned. They could not simply have vanished. Latou's men searched the area carefully. They could not find the mules, nor any trace that anyone had sneaked into their camp to steal the animals and their loads. This bizarre scenario of strange lights in the sky, followed by missing mules, was repeated over and over again throughout 1863 until by the fall of that year, the route was barely used. As the British Columbia government of the day had gone to a great deal of expense in order to build the trail, the authorities were most interested in making sure that it was being used. The fledgling Pinkerton Detective Agency was called in to help solve the mystery. They leaked word to the press that a mule train carrying 50,000 in gold would soon be making its way up to the trail. It was a ruse. All the miners on this truck were actually Pinkerton detectives, and they had no gold in their packs. The trip was merely a ploy to draw out the supposed phantom of the Caribou Trail, and to make the route seem more appealing to other travelers. The impostors slept even less than they had planned to, although they plotted out guarding schedules so that several men would be awake at all times. The investigators, whose turn it was to sleep, found that they weren't able to. Spectral lights kept everyone awake almost all of the time. Despite all the precautions, 3 mules somehow disappeared. The mystery continued for all of 1863 and into 1864. By 1865, however, the ghost lights in the night sky and the thefts of mules simply stopped as quickly as they had begun. Usage of the trail increased, and it began to serve as many people as the government had hoped it would. To this day, no one has any idea of what invisible presence haunted the Caribou Trail for those few months, nor was any trace of the dozen of missing pack animals ever found. The mule-stealing spirit from the early days of European settlement in this province was apparently working according to its own agenda and timeline.